"Wait, name your price," the saloon girl yelled, her voice cutting through the jeers of the crowd, as she recognized the captured hunter who had stumbled into her care 3 winters ago. More dead than alive, the town of Bitterroot Springs baked under a sun that showed no mercy, turning the wooden buildings into ovens and the dirt streets into rivers of dust that clung to everything it touched. In the center of the square stood a rough platform where men were bought and sold like cattle, where freedom became a commodity measured in silver dollars and crumpled bills. The crowd that gathered on this particular afternoon was smaller than usual, drawn by curiosity more than genuine interest, because the man on the platform was not the typical offering. Shapa Grey Wolf stood with his hands bound in front of him, his head unbowed despite the rope marks on his wrists and the bruises darkening his copper skin. He was tall and broad-shouldered, his body lean with the kind of strength that came from living off the land rather than working it. His dark hair hung past his shoulders, tangled and matted with dirt, and his buckskin clothing was torn and stained with blood. But it was his eyes that caught attention, dark as obsidian and burning with a defiance that made even the boldest men in the crowd shift uncomfortably. The auctioneer, a rail-thin man named Clemens with a face like sun-dried leather, wiped sweat from his forehead and addressed the crowd with practiced enthusiasm. "Here we have a prime specimen, gentlemen," he called out. "Strong as an ox, knows the land like the back of his hand, can track anything that walks or crawls." He gestured toward Shapa as if displaying a prized horse. "Caught him trying to steal. Horses from the Johnson Ranch, which means he is available for purchase under territorial law." "A lie," Shapa said quietly, his voice carrying despite its low volume. The auctioneer's face reddened. "You will speak when spoken to, savage." Shapa's jaw tightened, but he said nothing more. The crowd muttered, some with disapproval at his audacity, others with the uncomfortable awareness that came from witnessing injustice but lacking the courage to challenge it. Rose Daniel stood at the edge of the crowd, her hands gripping the worn fabric of her skirt. She had not planned to come to the square today, had in fact tried to avoid it, knowing the sight of human beings sold like livestock made her stomach turn. But something had drawn her here, some instinct she could not name, and now she understood why. The man on that platform, battered and bound, was someone she recognized 3 years ago. In the depths of winter, Rose had been closing the saloon after a long night when she heard scratching at the back door. She had opened it to find a Tofinda. Man collapsed in the snow, barely conscious, his body racked with fever. He had been stabbed, the wound in his side still seeping blood, and hypothermia had already begun its deadly work. Rose had no medical training beyond the basics learned from necessity, but she had dragged him inside, built up the fire and spent 3 days nursing him back from death's doorstep. She had fed him broth when he could barely swallow, changed his bandages when infection threatened, and sat beside him through the worst of the fever when he thrashed and spoke in a language she did not understand. When he finally woke, truly woke, his eyes had focused on her with confusion and then profound gratitude. "You saved my life," he had said simply. Rose had shrugged, uncomfortable with the weight of his thanks. Anyone would have done the same. But they both knew that was not true. He had stayed only 2 more days, long enough to regain some strength, and then he was gone. Rose had woken one morning to find him vanished, the only evidence of his presence a small carved stone left on the table, smooth and dark with a white band running through it. She had kept it, tucking it into her belongings, and sometimes when the saloon grew too loud and the men too rough, she would hold it and remember that small act of kindness she had offered to a stranger. Now that stranger stood on an auction block, and Rose felt something ignite in her chest. The auctioneer was calling for bids, starting at $40. A few hands rose half-heartedly. $50, someone called. $55, another voice added. Rose pushed through the crowd, her heart pounding. She had money, not much, but she had been saving for months with the vague dream of buying her way out of the saloon, of starting fresh somewhere else. That money was hidden in her room, every dollar hard-earned and carefully hoarded. 60, a large man with a cruel mouth called out. Rose recognized him as Thornton, a rancher known for working his laborers to death and paying them nothing. If Thornton bought Shapa, the hunter would be lucky to survive a year. The auctioneer grinned. $60. Do I hear 65? Wait, Rose heard herself shout. The crowd turned to stare, and the auctioneer squinted at her. Miss Daniels, he said with barely concealed contempt. This is not a place for women. I have money, Rose said, stepping forward, and I wish to bid. The auctioneer's expression soured, but law was law, even in a town like Bitterroot Springs. Very well, he said grudgingly. What is your bid, Rose? Locked eyes with Shapa, and in that moment, recognition flared between them. His eyes widened fractionally, surprise breaking through his stoic mask. She saw him mouth a single word, you, and she nodded almost imperceptibly. Name your price, she said to the auctioneer, her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands. The crowd erupted in murmurs and laughter. A woman buying a man. This was entertainment they had not expected. The auctioneer looked uncertain, glancing at Thornton, who scowled but said nothing. The current bid is $60, Clemens said. Rose swallowed hard. 75, she declared. The square went quiet. $75 was more than most men in this town made in 3 months. Thornton studied Rose with narrowed eyes, then spat into the dirt. Not worth it for a half-breed tracker, he muttered, turning away. The auctioneer looked around, hoping for another bid, but none came. Going once, he called. Going twice. He brought his hand down with a sharp crack. Sold to Miss Daniels for $75. Rose felt her knees go weak, but she forced herself to walk forward. The crowd parted, some snickering, others shaking their heads at her foolishness. She approached the platform where Shapa stood watching her with an expression she could not quite read. The auctioneer held out his hand expectantly. Payment first, Miss Daniels. I need to retrieve it from my room, Rose said. It will take only a few minutes. The auctioneer's face hardened. The sale is not final until payment is rendered. You will bring the money now, or the bidding will reopen. Rose nodded and turned, walking as quickly as dignity would allow back to the saloon. Her room was on the second floor, a cramped space with a single window and a bed that sagged in the middle. She knelt beside the bed and pulled up the loose floorboard where she kept her savings. The money was still there, thank God, wrapped in a piece of cloth. Rose counted it quickly, her hands shaking. $75 exactly, plus a few extra coins she had forgotten about. She wrapped it all back up and hurried downstairs, ignoring the curious looks from the bartender and the early afternoon customers. Outside, the sun seemed even hotter, and Rose felt sweat trickle down her spine as she made her way back to the square. The crowd had thinned, but the auctioneer and Shapa remained, along with a deputy who had been called to witness the transaction. Rose handed over the money, and Clemens counted it twice before nodding with evident disappointment. The sale is complete, he said. He cut the ropes binding Shapa's wrists with rough efficiency. He is your property now, Miss Daniels. Do with him as you see fit. The word property made Rose's skin crawl, but she nodded. Shapa stepped down from the platform, and for the first time, she saw how badly he had been treated. Besides the obvious bruises, he moved stiffly, favoring his left side, and his feet were bare and cut. Come with me, Rose said quietly. Shapa nodded once and followed her. They walked through the town in silence, Rose leading the way while Shapa stayed a few paces behind. People stared, some with open hostility, others with amusement. Rose kept her eyes forward, refusing to acknowledge the whispers and catcalls. When they reached the saloon, she led him around back to the external staircase that led to her room. Inside, she gestured to the single chair. Sit, she said. Shapa remained standing. "Why did you do that?" he asked, his voice rough from disuse. Rose met his eyes. "Because 3 years ago, I opened a door and found you dying in the snow." She paused. "Because you said I saved your life. Consider us even now." Shapa's expression softened fractionally. "That debt was already paid," he said. "You owed me nothing." "Maybe not," Rose replied. "But I could not stand there and watch them sell you to Thornton." She moved to her small basin and poured water into it. "Sit down before you fall down. You are injured." This time Shapa did not argue. He lowered himself into the chair with a barely suppressed grunt of pain. Rose approached with a clean cloth and began gently cleaning the dirt and dried blood from his face. He flinched at first, then held still, watching her with an intensity that made her self-conscious. "Your side," she said. "The same place as before." "Different wound," Shapa replied. "Same bad luck." A faint smile touched his lips, the first she had seen. Rose carefully lifted the torn edge of his shirt and examined the gash along his ribs. It was not deep, but would need cleaning and binding. She worked in silence, her hands steady despite the strange intimacy of the moment. When she finished, she stepped back. "You need rest and food. I need to leave this town," Shapa said. "They accused me of stealing horses I was hired to track. The man who hired me decided it was easier to sell me than pay me." He stood, testing his balance. "I cannot stay here." Rose felt panic rise. "You cannot travel in your condition. Give yourself a few days to heal." Shapa shook his head. "Every day I stay puts you in danger. People saw you by me. They will talk, and talk leads to trouble." Rose knew he was right, but the thought of him leaving immediately, stumbling off into the wilderness still injured, made her chest tighten. "Then I will come with you," she heard herself say. Shapa stared at her. "What?" "I have nothing keeping me here," Rose said, the words tumbling out faster now. "I hate this place. Hate what I have become here. I was saving money to leave anyway." She gestured around the shabby room. "This is not a life. It is just existing. You do not know what you are saying," Shapa said gently. "The wilderness is not kind to those unprepared for it." "I am stronger than I look," Rose countered. "And you are in no condition to travel alone. You said yourself that you owe me nothing, but I am saying I want to go. Not because of debt, but because I choose to." Shapa studied her for a long moment, and Rose had the unsettling feeling he could see straight through to her core, to all the fear and loneliness and desperate hope she tried to hide. Finally, he nodded slowly. "Then we leave tonight," he said. "After dark, when fewer eyes are watching. Bring only what you can carry and nothing that will be missed." Rose felt a mixture of terror and exhilaration. "Tonight," she agreed. The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur. Rose went through the motions of her work in the saloon, serving drinks and deflecting the crude comments of customers, all while her mind raced with plans and doubts. What was she doing? She barely knew this man. Yet she had spent 3 days keeping him alive, and in those fevered moments when he had been delirious, she had seen something in him that she recognized, a fundamental decency, a quiet strength. And she trusted that, even if she could not fully explain why. As night fell, Rose packed a small bag with her few possessions, extra clothing, the money she had left, some food she had quietly taken from the saloon kitchen. She changed into her most practical dress and sturdy boots. When the saloon was at its noisiest, full of drunk miners and card games, she slipped out the back door and up to her room where Shapa waited in the shadows. He had found or fashioned a makeshift pack and had somehow acquired a knife, though Rose did not ask how. "Ready?" he asked. "Ready," Rose confirmed, though her heart hammered so hard she thought it might burst. Shapa moved to the window and opened it silently. "There is a roof below. We climb down, stay in the shadows, and head north." Rose nodded, and together they slipped out into the night. They moved through Bitterroot Springs like ghosts, keeping to the dark spaces between buildings, avoiding the main streets where lantern lights spilled from saloons and gambling halls. A dog barked once, making Rose's heart leap, but they kept moving. At the edge of town, they paused, and Shapa looked back one final time. Then he turned north, and Rose followed. The night swallowed them, and with each step away from Bitterroot Springs, Rose felt something loosen in her chest. Behind them lay everything familiar, however miserable. Ahead lay uncertainty and danger. But beside her walked a man she had saved once, and who had now, in his own way, saved her in return. As the town lights faded to nothing and the vast darkness of the Montana Territory embraced them, Rose realized she was not afraid. For the first time in years, she felt alive. The night was cold enough to make Rose's breath visible in small clouds, and the darkness was so complete, it felt like walking through black water. Shapa moved ahead with quiet confidence, his injured body somehow still capable of navigating terrain Rose could barely see. She followed as closely as she dared, her eyes adjusting slowly to the starlight that provided their only illumination. The ground beneath her feet changed from packed dirt to loose stones to soft grass, and more than once she stumbled, catching herself before falling. After what felt like hours but was probably less than one, Shapa finally stopped beside a cluster of cottonwood trees that marked the presence of water. "Creek," he said quietly, his first word since they had left town. "We rest here for a short time." Rose sank gratefully onto a fallen log, her legs aching and her lungs burning from the exertion and altitude. She heard Shapa moving in the darkness, then the soft sound of him drinking from the creek. "You should drink too," he said. "We have a long way to go before dawn." Rose made her way to the water's edge, kneeling carefully on the smooth stones. The creek water was ice cold and tasted of minerals and stone, but it was clean and refreshing. She drank deeply, then splashed some on her face, the shock of it clearing her head. When she stood, she found Shapa watching her, his expression difficult to read in the shadows. "How is your side?" she asked. "It hurts," he admitted. "But it will heal." He paused. "You did not have to do this. Leave everything." Rose shook her head. "I had nothing to leave. That room was not mine. That life was not mine." She met his eyes. "I was not free, not really. Just a different kind of captive." Shapa was quiet for a moment. "The difference is that you had walls and a roof. Where we are going has neither." "Then teach me," Rose said. "Teach me how to survive without them." Shapa tilted his head, considering. "Why do you trust me?" he asked. "You know almost nothing about me." Rose thought about the fevered man she had nursed 3 years ago, about the way he had thanked her with genuine humility before disappearing. "I know enough," she said simply. They rested only 20 minutes before Shapa insisted they move again. "Too close to town still," he explained. "By morning they will realize you are gone. Some will not care, but others will see it as theft. A white woman running off with an Indian will bring certain men after us." Rose felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. She had not considered that aspect, had been so focused on escaping that she had not thought about pursuit. The terrain grew rougher as they climbed, the gentle hills giving way to steeper slopes covered in pine and scrub oak. Rose's dress caught on branches and thorns, and she could feel blisters forming on her feet despite her boots. But she did not complain. Shapa was injured and still maintaining a pace that pushed her to her limits. If he could endure, so could she. The sky began to lighten gradually in the east, turning from black to deep blue to a pale gray that outlined the mountains ahead. By the time the sun broke the horizon, they had put considerable distance between themselves and Bitterroot Springs. Shapa led them to a rocky outcropping that provided shelter and a view of the valley below. "Here," he said. "We sleep through the day and travel again tonight." Rose looked at the hard ground dubiously. Shapa noticed and actually smiled. Not comfortable, but safe. That matters more. He pulled dried meat from his pack and offered half to Rose. She accepted it gratefully, her stomach reminding her that she had not eaten since yesterday afternoon. The meat was tough and heavily salted, but it gave her strength. They ate in silence, watching the sun paint the valley in shades of gold and amber. From this height, Bitterroot Springs was barely visible, a small smudge of civilization in a vast landscape. "Tell me what happened," Rose said after a while. "How you ended up on that platform." Shapa leaned back against the rock, his face showing the exhaustion he had been hiding. "A man named Garrett Cole hired me to track horses stolen from his ranch," he said. "I found them 3 days later in a canyon with a broken fence. The brands had been altered, but not well. I brought them back, and he accused you instead," Rose guessed. Shapa nodded. "He said I was the thief, that I had hidden them to collect a reward. Before I could defend myself, his men had me bound. He said it was easier to sell me than deal with territorial law." His voice was flat, but Rose could hear the anger beneath. "Some men see my skin and assume I have no rights they need to respect." Rose felt fury rise in her chest. "That is not justice." "Justice," Shapa said quietly, "is a word that means different things depending on who speaks it." He looked at her. "You risked much to buy me. If we are caught, they will say you stole property." Rose shook her head firmly. "You are not property. That paper means nothing." Shapa's expression softened. "You sound very certain." "I am certain," Rose said. "Whatever that auctioneer said, whatever the law claims, I know the truth. You are a person, not a possession." Shapa held her gaze for a long moment. "3 years ago, you saved my life without knowing who I was or what I had done. Now you have done it again. That is twice you have given me freedom." Rose felt heat rise to her cheeks. "What happened 3 years ago?" she asked. "The wound that brought you to my door." Shapa looked away, his jaw tightening. "A fight," he said simply. "Over a woman I was meant to marry. Her father did not approve of the match, hired men to make sure I understood his position." He gestured to where the old scar would be beneath his shirt. "They made their point clearly." Rose absorbed this, piecing together the story. "The woman. I never saw her again," Shapa said. "Her father moved her to another territory within a month." He paused. Perhaps it was for the best. A man who can be bought off with violence is not a man worth having as family. There was old pain in his voice, but also acceptance. "I am sorry," Rose said. Shapa shrugged. "The past is the past. We can carry it or leave it behind." He looked at her. "What about you? What brought you to a saloon in a town like Bitterroot Springs?" Rose hesitated, then decided he deserved honesty. "My family died of cholera when I was 16, she said. "My father, mother, younger brother, all within a week. I had no other relatives, no inheritance. A woman alone with no money has limited options." She paused, gathering the courage to continue. "I worked in a laundry first, then a boarding house. But the pay was barely enough to survive, and the work was brutal. When a man offered me a position in a saloon, I convinced myself it would be temporary, just until I saved enough for something better." She laughed bitterly. "That was 4 years ago. The something better never came, until now," Shapa said quietly. Rose met his eyes. "Until now," she agreed. They sat in comfortable silence as the sun climbed higher and the day grew warm. Eventually, exhaustion claimed them both. Shapa positioned himself where he could see the approach from below, his hand resting near his knife. Rose curled up against the rock, using her bag as a pillow, and despite the hard ground and the strangeness of everything, she fell asleep almost immediately. She woke to the sound of voices. Her eyes snapped open to find the sun now past its peak, the shadows lengthening. Shapa was already awake, pressed flat against the rock and peering down at the valley. He gestured sharply for silence, and Rose froze. The voices grew louder, and she could make out 3 men on horseback, moving along the trail below. They were still distant, but heading in their direction. Shapa moved back to where Rose crouched. "We need to go," he whispered. "Now." "But they will see us if we move," Rose protested. "Not if we go up instead of down," Shapa replied. He pointed to a narrow path that led higher into the mountains. "It will be harder, but they will expect us to descend toward easier terrain." Rose nodded, trusting his judgment. They gathered their belongings with agonizing slowness, making no sound that might carry. The voices below grew louder still, and Rose caught fragments of conversation. "Trail ends here," one man said. "Maybe they doubled back." Another voice, rougher and more determined, responded. "Or maybe they are smarter than we thought." "Spread out and search." Shapa touched Rose's arm and pointed urgently. They moved as quickly as silence would allow, climbing the narrow path that wound between massive boulders. Rose's heart hammered so loudly she was certain it would give them away. Behind them, she heard the sound of men dismounting, boots on stone, voices calling to each other. The search had begun. The path grew steeper and more treacherous, barely wide enough for one person. At one point, Rose's foot slipped on loose scree, sending pebbles skittering down. She froze, certain they had been discovered, but the noise was covered by a larger rockfall somewhere nearby. They kept climbing, Rose's lungs burning, her legs screaming in protest. But fear gave her strength she did not know she possessed. After what felt like an eternity, they reached a ledge high enough that the men below appeared as small figures moving among the rocks. Shapa pulled Rose into a crevice where they were completely hidden from view. They stayed there, pressed together in the narrow space, barely breathing, while the search continued below. Rose could feel Shapa's heart beating, could smell the sweat and blood and dust that clung to him. His body was warm against hers in the cool mountain air. Time moved strangely in that hidden space. Minutes felt like hours as they waited for the searchers to either find them or give up. Rose became acutely aware of every sensation, the rough stone against her back, the warmth of Shapa's breath near her ear, the faint smell of pine carried on the breeze. She realized with sudden clarity that she felt safer in this precarious hiding spot with this man she barely knew than she had felt in years of living in civilization. Finally, one of the voices below called out in frustration. "They are not here. We are wasting time." Another voice argued briefly, but eventually, the sound of horses being mounted carried up to their hiding place. The men rode away, their voices fading gradually. Even then, Shapa did not move for a long time, waiting to be absolutely certain they were gone. When he finally pulled back, Rose realized she was trembling. Reaction to the fear, to the close call, flooded through her. Shapa placed a steadying hand on her shoulder. "You did well," he said quietly. Not many people could have stayed that silent, that still. Rose managed a shaky nod. "What now?" she asked. "Now we continue up," Shapa replied. "We cannot go back down until we are certain they have given up the search. There's a place I know, higher in the mountains. We will be safe there." "How much higher?" Rose asked, looking at the steep terrain above them. Shapa followed her gaze. "High enough that most men would not think to look," he said. "High enough that we will need to be very careful." They spent the rest of the afternoon climbing, the path growing more challenging with each passing hour. Rose's hands were scraped and bleeding from grabbing rocks for support, and her dress was torn in a dozen places. But she pressed on, driven by the knowledge that stopping meant capture, and capture meant a fate worse than these mountains could offer. Shapa paused frequently to check on her, and several times he had to help her navigate particularly difficult sections. As twilight approached, they reached a high meadow where the air was noticeably thinner and patches of old snow still clung to shadowed areas. Rose was gasping for breath, her legs barely able to support her weight. Shapa pointed to a stand of trees at the far edge of the meadow. "There," he said. "We camp for the night." Rose nodded, unable to speak, and forced her protesting body to cover the final distance. The trees provided shelter from the wind that had picked up as evening fell. Shapa quickly gathered dry wood and built a small fire, keeping it low and positioned so the smoke would dissipate among the branches. The warmth was immediate and glorious. Rose sank to the ground and pulled off her boots, revealing blistered feet that made her wince. Shapa knelt beside her and examined them with clinical detachment. "You should have said something," he said.
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you.
Rose shook her head. What difference would it have made? We needed to keep moving. Shapa disappeared briefly and returned with a handful of plants Rose did not recognize. He crushed them between his hands, releasing a pungent smell, then gently applied the paste to her blisters. "It will help," he said. "And tomorrow I will make better wrappings." His touch was careful and impersonal, but Rose felt something shift in her chest as she watched him tend to her injuries. This man, who had every reason to distrust people after what had been done to him, was showing her kindness without hesitation. "Thank you," she said softly. Shapa met her eyes briefly, then nodded and moved back to the fire. They ate more of the dried meat and some berries Shapa had gathered during their climb. The food was meager, but Rose was too exhausted to care. As darkness settled completely over the mountains, the temperature dropped sharply. Rose pulled her shawl tighter, but it did little against the cold. Shapa noticed and moved closer, positioning himself so his body blocked the wind. "Better?" he asked. "Better," Rose confirmed. They sat in silence for a while, watching the small fire flicker and listening to the night sounds of the high country. Finally, Rose spoke. "Where are we going, Shapa? I mean, beyond just away from town." Shapa was quiet for a moment. "North," he said. "Toward the Canadian territories. It is wild country, few settlements, plenty of places to disappear." He glanced at her. "It will not be easy, nothing worth doing ever is," Rose replied. Shapa's expression softened into something that might have been a smile. "We are 2 days from a place where I have friends," he said. "People who will not ask questions and will help us if needed. After that, we will see." Rose nodded, accepting this vague plan because she had no better alternative. As the fire burned down to coals and exhaustion finally claimed them both, Rose lay on the hard ground and looked up at the stars visible through the tree branches. They were brighter than she had ever seen them, countless points of light in an impossibly dark sky. Beside her, Shapa's breathing had evened out in sleep, though she suspected even unconscious he remained alert to danger. She closed her eyes and let the sounds of the wilderness lull her toward sleep. And for the first time in as long as she could remember, she felt something that might have been hope. Morning came with a frost that painted everything white and made Rose's breath hang in the air like small ghosts. She woke shivering, her body stiff from sleeping on the cold ground, and found Shapa already awake and tending a small fire he had somehow coaxed back to life. He handed her a tin cup filled with hot water, steeped with some kind of bark, and though it tasted bitter, the warmth spread through her body like a blessing. "Your feet," he said without preamble. "Let me see them." Rose pulled off the makeshift bandages he had applied the night before, revealing blisters that looked angry and raw in the morning light. Shapa examined them carefully, then produced strips of soft leather from his pack. He wrapped her feet with expert precision, creating padding that would protect the worst spots. "Where did you learn to do this?" Rose asked. "My grandfather," Shapa replied. "He was a healer among our people. He taught me many things before he passed." He tied off the final wrap. "This will help, but you need proper moccasins. Your boots are destroying your feet." Rose looked at her worn leather boots, recognizing the truth in his words. They had been adequate for town life, but were wholly inadequate for mountain travel. "Can you make moccasins?" she asked. Shapa nodded. "But I need materials. Deerskin, sinew time." He glanced at the sky, gauging the hour. "We will reach my friend's camp by tonight if we keep steady pace. He has what we need." Rose pulled her boots back on over the leather wrappings, noting immediately that they felt better. "Thank you," she said. Shapa simply nodded and began packing their meager supplies. They descended from the high meadow through a series of switchbacks that made Rose's legs tremble with effort. The thin mountain air made every breath feel insufficient, and more than once she had to stop and rest, leaning against trees while her vision cleared. Shapa waited patiently each time, never showing frustration, though she knew their slow pace put them at risk. By mid-morning, they had dropped below the tree line into dense forest where the air was thicker and breathing came easier. The forest was alive with sounds Rose was learning to recognize. Bird calls that signaled all was well, the rustle of small animals in the underbrush, the distant sound of water flowing over stone. Shapa moved through it like a shadow, his footsteps nearly silent despite his injury. Rose tried to mimic his movements, placing her feet where he placed his, learning the rhythm of wilderness travel. It was exhausting work that demanded constant attention. Around noon, they stopped beside a small stream where clear water tumbled over smooth rocks. Shapa knelt and drank, then motioned for Rose to do the same. While she drank, he moved upstream and suddenly plunged his hand into the water with lightning speed. When he withdrew it, he held a fish that flipped and struggled in his grasp. Rose watched in amazement as he repeated the action twice more, ending with 3 fish laid out on the bank. "You caught them with your bare hands," she said, unable to hide her astonishment. Shapa used his knife to clean the fish with quick, efficient movements. "You learn to read the water," he explained. "Where they hide, how they move. It is not magic, just patience and practice." He gathered dry wood and built a small fire, then cooked the fish on flat stones he had positioned in the flames. The smell made Rose's stomach clench with hunger. They ate the fish with their fingers, the meat flaking apart and tasting of smoke in wild places. It was the best meal Rose had eaten in months, maybe years. She licked her fingers clean and looked at Shapa with new appreciation. "You could survive anywhere, couldn't you?" she said. Shapa considered the question. "I could survive many places," he agreed. "But survival is not the same as living. What is the difference?" Rose asked. He was quiet for a moment, watching the fire. "Survival is finding food, shelter, staying alive from one day to the next. Living is having reason to do those things. Purpose beyond simply not dying." He looked at her. "For a long time I only survived." "Then what changed?" Rose asked softly. Shapa's expression shifted to something distant. "My sister," he said. "Aida. She was 5 years younger than me, fierce and stubborn like our mother. After our parents died, I raised her, taught her everything I knew." He paused. 2 years ago, she married a good man, a trader. They moved west to start fresh, and suddenly I was alone." He fed another stick to the fire. "That was when I realized I had been surviving for her, not for myself." "And now?" Rose asked. Shapa met her eyes. "Now I am not certain. Perhaps I am still just surviving. Or perhaps something is changing." The weight of his gaze made Rose's breath catch. She looked away first, focusing on the fire. "I understand that feeling," she said quietly, "of going through motions without purpose. That was my life in Bitterroot Springs." They sat in companionable silence while the fire burned down, then continued their journey. The afternoon brought new challenges as the terrain grew rockier and the path less defined. Several times Shapa had to scout ahead to find the best route, leaving Rose to wait and watch the forest around her with nervous attention. Every sound seemed potentially threatening, every shadow possibly hiding danger. As the sun began its descent, casting long shadows through the trees, they emerged from the forest onto a ridge, that overlooked a small valley. Rose could see a thin column of smoke rising in the distance, marking the presence of human habitation. "There," Shapa said, pointing to the smoke. "My friend Dakota lives with his family. They will help us." Rose felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. "What if they don't want to help?" she asked. "They will," Shapa said with confidence. "Dakota and I grew up together. We are brothers in all ways that matter." He started down the ridge. "Come, we should arrive before full dark." The descent took longer than Rose expected, the fading light making the path treacherous. By the time they reached the valley floor, dusk had settled like a gray blanket over everything. The camp consisted of 3 structures built from logs and bark, arranged in a rough triangle around a central fire pit. Smoke rose from the largest structure, and Rose could hear voices inside speaking in a language she did not understand. Shapa paused at the edge of the clearing and made a sound, a sharp whistle that carried clearly through the evening air. The voices inside stopped abruptly. A moment later, a man emerged from the largest structure. He was shorter than Shapa, but powerfully built, with broad shoulders and a face marked by old scars. His eyes swept the clearing, landed on Shapa, and widened with surprise. He said something in his language, his tone questioning and pleased at once. Shapa responded, and the 2 men moved together, embracing with the easy affection of long friendship. They spoke rapidly in their shared language while Rose stood awkwardly at the edge of the clearing, suddenly aware of how she must look. Dirty, exhausted, dressed in torn clothing, and very obviously not belonging here. The man, Dakota she assumed, turned to look at her with frank curiosity. He said something to Shapa, his tone teasing. Shapa's response was quieter, more serious, and Dakota's expression shifted to concern. Dakota approached Rose and spoke in heavily accented English. "You are welcome here. Any friend of my brother is friend to us." He gestured toward the largest structure. "Come, my wife will have food. You look like you have traveled far." Rose managed a grateful smile. "Thank you," she said, her voice hoarse. "We have inside." The structure was warm and surprisingly spacious. A fire burned in a central pit, the smoke rising through a hole in the roof. A woman worked near the fire, stirring something in a large pot, while 2 small children played in the corner. The woman looked up as they entered, her eyes moving from Shapa to Rose with quick intelligence. She spoke to Dakota in their language. Her tone questioning, Dakota responded. Gesturing to Shapa and Rose, the woman's expression softened, and she immediately began preparing food, filling wooden bowls with a thick stew that smelled of meat and vegetables. She handed the bowls to Rose and Shapa with a warm smile that needed no translation. Rose accepted gratefully, murmuring thanks as she sank onto a woven mat near the fire. The stew was rich and filling, warming Rose from the inside out. She ate slowly, savoring every bite, while around her the conversation flowed in a language she could not follow. Occasionally, Shapa would translate key points, explaining that Dakota had heard about the auction in Bitterroot Springs. That word had spread quickly through the territory about a white woman buying a native man. The news had caused considerable talk. "Some say you are foolish," Dakota said, switching to English as he addressed Rose directly. "Others say you are brave. I think perhaps you are both." Rose met his eyes. "I only did what seemed right," she said. Dakota nodded approvingly. "What seems right is not always what is easy." He looked at Shapa. "You have chosen well in your friends." After the meal, Dakota's wife, whose name Rose learned was Mina, showed her to a corner of the structure where she could sleep. The bedding was simple but clean, piled with furs that promised warmth. Mina said something in her language and pantomimed washing. Rose understood and followed the woman outside to where a large pot of heated water waited. Mina handed her a cloth and a piece of soap made from some plant Rose did not recognize, then left her to privacy, The opportunity to wash away days of dirt and sweat was almost overwhelming. Rose stripped to her undergarments and scrubbed her skin until it was pink and clean. The water grew gray with dirt, and when she finally finished, she felt more human than she had in days. Mina returned with a clean dress, simpler than Rose's torn garment, but beautifully made from soft deerskin, decorated with small beads and geometric patterns. Rose changed gratefully, marveling at how the dress fit her body. When she returned to the main structure, she found the men still talking by the fire, their conversation serious. Shapa looked up as she entered, and something flickered in his eyes, an appreciation he quickly masked. "The dress suits you," he said simply. Rose felt heat rise to her cheeks. Dakota stood and spoke to his wife in their language. Mina nodded and began settling the children for sleep. Dakota turned to Shapa and Rose. "Tomorrow we will make preparations for your journey north," he said. "You will need supplies, proper clothing, weapons. Tonight you rest. You are safe here." Rose felt tears prick her eyes at the simple generosity. "Thank you," she managed. Dakota waved off her thanks. "Family helps family," he said. As the fire burned low and the household settled into sleep, Rose lay in her borrowed furs and listened to the unfamiliar sounds of this new place. The crackle of the fire, the soft breathing of sleeping children, the murmur of Dakota and Shapa's voices as they talked long into the night. She felt the bone-deep exhaustion of the past days beginning to ease, replaced by something fragile but real. Security, however temporary. The next morning brought clear skies and the smell of cooking food. Rose woke to find Mina already up and working, the children playing quietly while their mother prepared a morning meal. Shapa and Dakota were outside, and through the doorway, Rose could see them examining various items, weapons and tools spread on the ground between them. She rose and joined Mina by the fire, trying to communicate through gestures her desire to help. Mina seemed to understand and showed Rose how to prepare a type of bread, flat cakes that cooked quickly on hot stones. Rose watched and copied, her first attempts clumsy but improving. Mina laughed kindly at Rose's mistakes, gently correcting her technique. Despite the language barrier, Rose felt a connection forming, a wordless understanding between women who knew what it meant to survive in harsh places. After breakfast, Dakota announced his plan. "Today we make you ready for the journey," he said. "Rose needs proper clothing, footwear, supplies. Shapa needs weapons to replace what was taken." He gestured to a pile of items. "I have some things to spare, and we can make the rest." Rose started to protest the generosity, but Dakota held up a hand. "A debt of friendship has no price," he said. The day passed in productive activity. Mina worked with Rose to alter several pieces of clothing to fit her properly, creating layers that would protect against cold and weather. Dakota showed Shapa various weapons, and they selected a rifle, a good knife, and a hatchet. Meanwhile, Shapa sat with materials Dakota provided and began constructing moccasins for Rose, his hands working with practiced skill. Rose watched him work during breaks from her own tasks, noting the careful precision of each stitch, the way he tested the fit repeatedly against the measurements he had taken of her feet. When he finally finished as afternoon light slanted through the doorway, he handed them to Rose with quiet pride. "Try them," he said. Rose slipped them on and immediately felt the difference. They fit perfectly, supporting her feet while allowing flexibility. "They are wonderful," she said sincerely. As evening approached, Dakota gathered them around the fire for a serious conversation. "You should stay here longer," he urged. "Rest properly, regain strength. Winter comes soon to the high country." Shapa shook his head. "We cannot risk it. The men who search for us may follow our trail here. I will not bring danger to your family." Dakota frowned but eventually nodded. "I understand," he said reluctantly. That night, the household held a small feast in honor of their guest's departure. The food was plentiful and delicious, And afterward Dakota told stories while his children listened with wide eyes. Rose could not understand the words, but she felt the rhythm of the storytelling, the way Dakota's voice rose and fell, the way the children reacted at certain moments. It reminded her of something she had lost long ago, the feeling of belonging to something larger than herself. Later, as they prepared for sleep, Shapa approached Rose where she sat mending a tear in her new clothes. "Tomorrow we leave at first light," he said. "The journey will be harder from here. Fewer places to find shelter, less game as we go higher." He paused. "Are you certain you want to continue?" Rose looked up at him, seeing the concern in his dark eyes. "I am certain," she said firmly. "I did not leave Bitterroot Springs to turn back now." Shapa held her gaze for a long moment, then nodded. "Good," he said quietly. "Because I find I do not want to make this journey alone." The admission hung between them, weighted with meaning neither was quite ready to examine. Rose felt something shift in her chest, a recognition that what had begun as repaying a debt had become something else entirely. Something that felt like partnership, like the beginning of trust that went both ways. She returned her attention to her mending, but a small smile played at her lips. That night, Rose's sleep was deeper and more restful than it had been since leaving town. In the morning, she woke to find final preparations already underway. Mina pressed food parcels into Rose's hands, her eyes warm with understanding. Dakota loaded supplies onto Shapa's back, refusing to hear any more protests about the generosity. Finally, as the sun broke over the mountains, it was time to leave. Rose embraced Mina, feeling the other woman's strength and kindness in that brief contact. Dakota and Shapa spoke quietly in their language, then embraced as brothers do. Dakota turned to Rose and placed his hand briefly on her shoulder. "You walk a hard path," he said, "but you do not walk it alone. Remember that." Rose nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. As they left the camp and began climbing back toward the high country, Rose looked back once to see Dakota's family watching from the clearing, hands raised in farewell. Then the forest swallowed the view, and they were alone again. But something had changed. She and Shapa were no longer simply fugitive and rescuer, but travelers with a shared destination. Companions on a journey neither had expected, but both had chosen. The climb into the high country tested every limit Rose thought she possessed. The air grew thinner with each passing hour, until every breath felt like trying to fill her lungs with mist. The terrain shifted from forested slopes to exposed rock faces where one misstep could mean a fatal fall. Shapa led the way with unwavering confidence, but even he moved more slowly now. His injured side clearly causing pain despite his refusal to acknowledge it. They traveled for 3 days through increasingly desolate landscape, sleeping in whatever shelter they could find and eating sparingly from the supplies Dakota had provided. The nights were brutally cold, and they took turns keeping watch while huddled close to small fires that offered more psychological comfort than actual warmth. During those long nights, they talked in low voices about meaningless things at first, then gradually about matters that held more weight. Rose learned that Shapa had once wanted to be a teacher, to preserve the stories and knowledge of his people before they were lost to time and violence. But the world had other plans, he said with bitter acceptance. A man with my face does not get to choose such gentle paths. Rose understood this in a way she wished she did not. The world decided for people like them, dictated what roles they could fill based on factors beyond their control. On the 4th day, the weather turned. Clouds rolled in from the north, heavy and dark with the promise of snow. Shapa studied the sky with growing concern, then quickened their pace despite his injury. "We need to find shelter," he said. "Real shelter, not just an overhang. The storm will be serious." Rose looked at the barren landscape around them, seeing nothing that resembled protection. "Where?" she asked. Shapa pointed to a distant ridge where rock formations created strange shapes against the darkening sky. "There," he said. I remember this place from years ago. There are caves, deep ones that stay dry. If we can reach them before the storm hits." He did not finish the sentence, but Rose understood the implication. If they were caught in the open when the storm arrived, they would likely not survive. They ran when the terrain allowed it, scrambled over rocks when it did not, driven by the pressure of the approaching weather. Rose's lungs burned and her legs screamed in protest, but fear gave her strength. Behind them, the sky grew darker and the wind picked up, carrying the smell of snow and something else, danger, primal and undeniable. The first flakes began to fall as they reached the base of the ridge. The climb up was nightmarish. The rock was loose and treacherous, offering few secure handholds. Rose's fingers were numb within minutes, making it difficult to grip. Twice she slipped, and both times Shapa caught her, his hand clamping around her wrist with iron strength. "Keep moving," he urged. "We are close." The snow began falling harder, thick flakes that obscured vision and made the rocks slippery. When they finally reached the caves, Rose was shaking so violently she could barely stand. Shapa guided her into the nearest opening, a dark mouth in the rock that extended back into shadows. Once inside, the howl of the wind became muffled, distant. Shapa moved deeper into the cave, testing the ground, checking for signs of animals or instability. "It is safe," he announced, "and it goes back far enough that we can build a fire without the wind reaching it." Rose sank to the cave floor, her body finally giving in to exhaustion. She watched through blurring vision as Shapa worked with methodical efficiency, despite his own obvious fatigue. He gathered the small amount of dry wood they had been carrying, arranged stones for a fire pit, and coaxed flames to life with skilled hands. The light pushed back the darkness, revealing a cave larger than Rose had initially thought. With walls that showed signs of ancient use. "There are markings," Rose said, noticing shapes carved into the stone near the entrance. Shapa moved closer to examine them, running his fingers over the carved lines. "Old," he said quietly. "Very old. These are not from my people, but from those who came before." He traced one marking that looked like a hand. "They left their mark to say they survived this place. Now we add our own survival to this cave's memory." The storm raged outside with terrifying intensity. Wind howled through the rocks like a living thing, and the temperature dropped so low that Rose could see her breath even near the fire. Shapa positioned their supplies to create a windbreak and spread out the furs Dakota had given them. "We will need to share warmth," he said matter-of-factly. "The cold will be deadly otherwise." Rose nodded, understanding the necessity. They huddled together under the furs, their backs against the cave wall, feeding the fire periodically to keep it alive. Rose could feel Shapa's warmth along her side, could hear his steady breathing, and slowly her shaking subsided. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for getting us here, for keeping us alive." Shapa was silent for a moment. "You have kept pace every step," he replied. "You have not complained when you had every right to. That is not something to discount." The hours passed slowly while the storm continued its assault. They dozed fitfully, waking to tend the fire or adjust their position. During one of these wakeful periods, Rose noticed that Shapa was moving stiffly, his face tight with pain. "Your side," she said. "It is bothering you more than you are admitting." Shapa tried to wave off her concern, but Rose would not let it go. "Let me see it," she insisted, reluctantly. Shapa lifted his shirt to reveal the wound from the knife fight that had landed him on the auction block. The stitches Rose had placed days ago were holding, but the surrounding skin was red and hot to the touch. "It is infected," Rose said, worry sharp in her voice. "We need to clean it properly."
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story.
Shapa shook his head. "We have no proper medicine here. It will have to wait until we reach lower elevation. Rose remembered the poultice Shapa had made for her blistered feet, remembered watching Takota's wife work with herbs and plants. "I may not know your remedies," she said, "but I know infection kills if left untreated. The snow outside is clean. I can use it to cool the inflammation, and we have some of the salve Mina gave us. It is better than nothing." For once, Shapa did not argue. Rose worked carefully, cleaning the wound with melted snow and applying the salve with gentle fingers. Shapa's jaw was tight with pain, but he did not make a sound. When she finished, she fashioned a fresh bandage from strips of cloth Mina had packed. "There," she said. "It should help until we can get proper treatment." As she settled back beside him, Shapa caught her hand briefly. "You did not have to learn these things," he said quietly. "Did not have to come on this journey. Did not have to risk yourself repeatedly for someone you barely know." Rose met his eyes in the firelight. "I know you better than you think," she replied. "I know you are stubborn and proud. I know you push yourself beyond what is wise. I know you carry wounds deeper than the physical ones." She paused. "And I know you would have done the same for me." Something shifted in Shapa's expression, a barrier lowering that he had kept firmly in place. "3 years ago, when you found me dying in the snow," he said slowly, "I had given up. I was ready to let the cold take me because living with the shame of losing Aida, of being beaten and branded as unworthy, seemed worse than death." He looked at the fire. "But you did not let me go. You fought for my life when I would not. That changed something in me." Rose felt her throat tighten. "I did what anyone would do." "No," Shapa said firmly. "You did what few would do. You saw a stranger, someone who looked nothing like you, someone society told you was less than human, and you chose to save him anyway." He turned to face her fully. "That choice echoed through 3 years until it brought us both to this cave. Tell me that is not significant." Rose had no answer that felt adequate. Instead, she leaned her head against his shoulder, a gesture of trust and weariness combined. They sat that way for a long time, listening to the storm rage outside, feeling the warmth of the fire and each other. Two people who had saved each other's lives, now saving each other in different ways. Eventually, exhaustion claimed them both, and they slept deeply despite the cold and the noise. Rose woke to silence. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world transformed. She crawled to the cave entrance and gasped at what she saw. Everything was buried under snow, the landscape rendered unrecognizable, beautiful and terrifying in equal measure. The sun was rising, painting the white expanse in shades of pink and gold. It was breathtaking and deadly. Shapa joined her at the entrance, his face grave as he assessed their situation. "We are trapped," he said flatly. "That much snow will take days to become passable, and we do not have days of supplies." Rose felt panic flutter in her chest. "What do we do?" Shapa studied the landscape with the intensity of someone solving a puzzle. "We cannot go back the way we came," he said slowly. "But there may be another way." He pointed to what looked like a valley between two peaks. "If that is what I think it is, it leads down to lower elevation. The snow will be less deep there, but we have to cross all of this to reach it," Rose said, gesturing to the expanse of snow between them and the valley. Shapa nodded. "It will be difficult, dangerous, but staying here means certain death when our supplies run out." He looked at her. "Can you do this?" Rose thought about everything they had already survived, about the fact that turning back was not an option. "Yes," she said with more confidence than she felt. "I can do this." They spent the morning preparing, fashioning crude snowshoes from branches and strips of hide, packing their remaining supplies carefully, and eating a small meal to give them strength. Shapa checked and rechecked his wound, grimacing but declaring it acceptable. As the sun climbed higher, they set out into the snow. The journey was immediately brutal. The snow was deep enough in places that even with snowshoes, they sank to their knees. The sun's glare off the white surface was blinding, forcing them to squint constantly. And the cold was relentless, seeping through their layers of clothing and stealing their body heat with patient malice. They moved slowly, conserving energy, stopping frequently to rest despite the danger of stopping too long. By midday, they had covered perhaps a quarter of the distance to the valley. Rose's legs trembled with exhaustion, and her face was burned from the sun and wind. Shapa was faring little better, his injury clearly taxing his strength. They stopped to rest in the lee of a large boulder, sharing the last of their water and a few bites of dried meat. "We will make it," Shapa said, though Rose was not sure if he was trying to convince her or himself. The afternoon brought a new challenge. The sun had warmed the snow enough that it became unstable in places. They were traversing a slope when Rose felt the ground shift beneath her feet. "Avalanche!" Shapa shouted, grabbing her arm and pulling her uphill. They scrambled desperately as the snow below them began to move, slowly at first, then with gathering speed. Rose's snowshoe caught on something, and she fell, sliding backward. Shapa threw himself flat and caught her wrist with both hands, his body anchored by sheer force of will. Rose dangled for a moment, watching the snow cascade down the slope in a white river. Then Shapa pulled with strength that should not have been possible given his injury. She clawed her way up beside him, and they lay gasping on stable ground while the last of the avalanche rumbled past below. "That was too close," Rose managed when she could speak. Shapa nodded, his face pale beneath the bronze of his skin. His hands were shaking, and Rose realized the effort had cost him greatly. "We need to keep moving," he said, but his voice lacked its usual certainty. Rose stood and helped him to his feet, noticing how heavily he leaned on her. "Your wound," she said. "It opened," Shapa admitted, his hand pressed to his side where blood was beginning to seep through his clothing. Rose felt fear sharper than any she had experienced on this journey. They were miles from help, in terrain that could kill them in dozens of ways, and Shapa was bleeding. "We have to stop and treat this," she said firmly. "Not here," Shapa replied, gesturing to the exposed slope. "Too dangerous. We reach the valley first." Rose wanted to argue but recognized the truth in his words. She helped him fashion a tighter binding around his ribs using cloth from their packs. Then they continued. The next hours were a blur of pain and determination. Shapa grew weaker with each step, and Rose found herself supporting more and more of his weight. The valley that had seemed close in the morning remained frustratingly distant as shadows began to lengthen. Rose's own strength was failing, her body pushed beyond anything she had thought possible. But she refused to stop, refused to let them die in this frozen wasteland. As twilight approached, they finally staggered into the valley. The snow was indeed shallower here, and Rose could see exposed ground in places where the wind had swept the surface clear. She spotted a cluster of pine trees that would provide shelter and steered Shapa toward them. He collapsed as soon as they reached the trees, his face gray with blood loss and exhaustion. Rose's hands shook as she built a fire, her movements mechanical and desperate. When the flames finally caught, she turned her attention to Shapa's wound. It was worse than she had feared, the infection spreading despite her earlier treatment, the reopened cut bleeding freely. She cleaned it as best she could with melted snow, applied the last of their salve, and bound it tightly. Shapa drifted in and out of consciousness, occasionally murmuring in his language as night fell completely. Rose sat beside him and faced the possibility that she might lose him. After everything they had survived, after all the miles and dangers, he might die here in this valley from an infection and exhaustion. The thought was unbearable. She had not fully acknowledged until this moment how much he had come to mean to her, how his quiet strength had become something she relied on, how his presence had filled spaces in her life she had not known were empty. "Stay with me," she whispered, gripping his hand. "You saved my life on that auction platform. You have saved it a dozen times since. Now let me save yours. Do not give up. Not now. Not after we have come so far. Shapa's eyes opened briefly, focusing on her face. Rose, he breathed. I am here, she said. I am right here. And I am not leaving you. Through that long night, Rose kept vigil. She maintained the fire, gave Shapa water when he could swallow, talked to him when he seemed to slip too far into unconsciousness. She told him about her childhood, about her family, about dreams she had given up and dreams she was beginning to discover. She did not know if he heard her, but she talked anyway, filling the darkness with sound and hope. Dawn came slowly, painting the sky in gradual shades of gray, then gold. Rose, exhausted beyond measure, felt Shapa stir beside her. His eyes opened and focused on her with more clarity than they had held the night before. You stayed, he said, his voice hoarse but stronger. Of course I stayed, Rose replied, tears suddenly streaming down her face. Did you think I would leave you? Shapa reached up and touched her cheek, his fingers cold but steady. I hoped you would save yourself if needed, he said. But I am glad you did not. The crisis had passed. Shapa's fever had broken during the night, and though he was weak, he was going to survive. Rose helped him drink and eat small amounts, then checked his wound. The infection looked better, the angry redness receding. We need to stay here until you are stronger, she said. There is no rush now. Shapa nodded, too tired to argue. They spent 2 days in that valley, resting and recovering. Rose hunted for small game with snares Shapa taught her to make, and she found edible plants under the snow using knowledge he shared. Slowly, they both regained strength. And in those quiet days, something deepened between them. An understanding that went beyond words, a bond forged in survival and choice, and the simple fact that they had refused to let each other go. On the morning of the 3rd day, Shapa declared himself ready to continue. The journey north still called to them, and they had promises to keep, if only to themselves. As they packed their supplies and prepared to leave the valley, Rose looked back at the place where they had nearly died. We survived this too, she said softly. Shapa stood beside her, his hand finding hers. We did, he agreed. Together, the descent from the high country took them through terrain that gradually softened. The harsh rock and snow giving way to pine forests and meadows, where early spring grass pushed through patches of melting ice. Shapa's strength returned slowly but steadily, and Rose noticed how the lines of pain around his eyes eased with each passing day. They traveled at a measured pace now, no longer driven by immediate danger, but by the steady pull of an uncertain future. On the 5th day after leaving the valley, they encountered the first sign of civilization they had seen in weeks. A hunting cabin sat in a clearing beside a frozen stream, smoke rising from its chimney in a thin gray line. Shapa studied it carefully from the cover of the trees. One person inside, he said quietly. The tracks show only one set of boots, large, probably a man. Rose felt tension coil in her stomach. Is it safe to approach? Shapa was silent for a long moment, weighing risks. We need supplies, he said finally, and information about what lies ahead. But we approach carefully. He led them in a wide circle around the cabin, observing from different angles, noting the horse tied in a small shelter and the well-maintained equipment visible through a window. Whoever lives here takes care of their possessions, he observed. That speaks to character. They waited until late afternoon when the angle of the sun would make it difficult for someone inside to see them clearly approaching. Shapa moved to the door with Rose slightly behind him, his hand near his knife though not threatening. He knocked firmly, 3 solid strikes that echoed in the clearing. A long pause followed, then the sound of footsteps. The door opened to reveal a man in his 60s with a full gray beard and sharp, blue eyes that took in both visitors in a single sweeping glance. You are a long way from anywhere, the man said, his voice carrying the rough edges of someone who spent more time talking to himself than to others. His eyes lingered on Rose's deerskin dress and Shappa's clearly native features. "And you look like you have a story worth hearing." Shappa nodded carefully. "We have traveled far and need direction north. Also supplies if you can spare them." "We can pay." The man's eyebrows rose. "With what work?" Rose said, stepping forward. "I can cook, clean, mend. Whatever you need. Shappa can hunt, repair, build. We are not asking for charity." The man studied her with new interest, noting the determination in her voice despite her obvious exhaustion. "Name is Caleb Harrison," he said. "And I am not in the habit of turning away folks who look like they have been through hell itself." He stepped back from the door. "Come in. Let us talk about this properly." The interior of the cabin was Spartan but clean, with the efficiency that spoke of long practice living alone. Harrison gestured to chairs near the fire while he poured coffee from a battered pot. When they were all seated, he fixed them with a direct gaze. "Now tell me true," he said. "Are you running from the law?" Shappa met his eyes steadily. "I was falsely accused of horse theft and sold at auction in Bitterroot Springs. Rose bought my freedom. We are heading north to start fresh where our faces are not known." Harrison took a long sip of coffee, his expression unreadable. "I heard about that auction," he said slowly. "Word travels even to places like this. There has been some talk about a white woman and a native man who disappeared together. Some folks are calling it a scandal. Others are calling it theft." He looked at Rose. "You have made yourself enemies. I made myself free," Rose replied firmly. "Whatever enemies came with that choice, I will face them." Harrison's stern expression cracked into something that might have been approval. "I respect that," he said. "Lord knows this territory has too many people worried about what others think instead of doing what is right." He stood and moved to a shelf, pulling down a worn map. "You want north, that is simple enough. But simple and easy are not the same thing." He spread the map on the table, pointing to various locations. "You are here, roughly. North takes you through 2 more mountain passes before you reach flatter country. After that, another 100 miles to the Canadian territories." He traced the route with a gnarled finger. "This time of year, those passes can still be deadly. And there are men who make their living robbing travelers in the wild places between towns." "We have faced worse," Shappa said quietly. Harrison looked at him appraisingly. "I believe you have. But worse does not make future dangers less real." He rolled up the map. "Stay here tonight. In the morning, I will give you supplies and better directions. Consider it payment for honest company and conversation, which is worth more than gold to an old man who spends too much time alone." That evening, Harrison proved to be a surprisingly good cook, preparing venison stew with vegetables from his root cellar. Over the meal, he told stories of his years in the mountains, of the changes he had witnessed as civilization pushed ever deeper into wilderness. "I came out here 30 years ago," he said, "to escape a world that made no sense to me. Found that the wilderness makes its own kind of sense, harder but cleaner." He looked between Shappa and Rose. "You two are learning that now." Rose found herself relaxing in a way she had not since leaving Dakota's camp. Harrison's presence was gruff but fundamentally kind, and his acceptance of their situation without judgment felt like a gift. She helped him clean up after the meal while Shappa discussed hunting patterns and animal movements with the old trapper. When Rose returned to the fire, she found the 2 men in animated conversation about tracking techniques. That night, Harrison offered them the cabin's single bed while he took blankets by the fire. Rose protested, but the old man would not hear arguments. "You have been sleeping on cold ground for too long," he said firmly. "Take comfort where it is offered." Shappa and Rose shared the bed with a careful distance between them, both acutely aware of the other's presence in this small space. Rose lay awake for a long time, listening to Shappa's breathing and feeling the warmth that radiated from his body. In the morning, Harrison was true to his word. He packed supplies for them, dried meat and hardtack, coffee and salt, even a small bag of cornmeal. He also provided a better knife for Rose and checked over Shappa's weapons with a critical eye. "Your rifle is adequate," he told Shappa, "but this powder is better quality." He handed over a horn of gunpowder. "Use it wisely." As they prepared to leave, Harrison pulled Rose aside. "That man you are traveling with," he said quietly, "is a good one. I have met many men in these mountains, and most are running from something or toward something. He is different. He is simply moving forward." Rose nodded, understanding more than the words conveyed. "I know," she said softly. Harrison also spoke privately with Shappa, their conversation too low for Rose to hear. When Shappa returned to her side, his expression was thoughtful. "What did he say?" Rose asked. Shappa hesitated. "He said that the most dangerous part of any journey is deciding when it has ended. That we will need to choose carefully when to stop running and start building." Rose pondered this wisdom as they bid Harrison farewell and resumed their journey north. The next week brought them through varying terrain. From dense forest to open meadows where wildflowers were beginning to bloom in defiance of the lingering cold. They fell into an easy rhythm, their movements synchronized through practice and mutual understanding. Shappa taught Rose to read weather signs in the clouds and animal behavior. Rose shared stories and songs from her childhood, filling their campsites with words and melodies that made the wilderness feel less empty. One evening, as they made camp beside a clear stream, Rose noticed Shappa watching her with an expression she had not seen before. "What is it?" she asked. Shappa seemed to wrestle with words. "When I was on that auction platform," he said slowly, "I had accepted that my life was over. Not that I would die, but that anything worth living for had been taken from me." He fed a stick to their fire. "Then I saw you in the crowd, and I recognized you, and everything changed." Rose felt her heart beat faster. "Changed how?" Shappa met her eyes across the flames. "I remembered that 3 years ago, a woman saved my life without knowing me. And I realized that if such kindness existed once, it might exist again. That perhaps the world was not as cruel as I had believed." He paused. "You gave me that gift twice. First my life, then my hope." Rose moved around the fire to sit beside him, close enough that their shoulders touched. "You gave me gifts too," she said quietly. "You gave me purpose when I had none. You gave me a reason to be brave. You showed me that strength does not mean hardness, that survival does not require cruelty." She turned to face him fully. "I would not want to make this journey with anyone else." Shappa's hand found hers, their fingers intertwining naturally. For a long moment, they simply sat together, connected by touch and something deeper that neither had found words for yet. The fire crackled, the stream murmured, and the world felt smaller and larger at the same time. Then Shappa leaned forward and pressed his forehead against hers, a gesture of intimacy that spoke volumes. "I do not know what waits for us north," he said softly. "I cannot promise safety or comfort or any of the things you deserve. But I can promise that whatever comes, we face it together." Rose closed her eyes, feeling the warmth of him, the solid reality of his presence. "That is all I need," she whispered. "That is everything." The moment stretched, fragile and perfect, until Shappa pulled back slightly. His hand came up to cup her face, his thumb tracing her cheekbone with infinite gentleness. "Rose," he breathed, and her name on his lips felt like both question and answer. She leaned into his touch, her own hand coming up to cover his. "Yes," she said, though she was not entirely sure what she was agreeing to. Only that it felt right, more right than anything in her life had felt before. They stayed that way until the fire burned low, then lay down together under their shared blankets with none of the careful distance that had marked previous nights. Rose rested her head on Shappa's shoulder, feeling his arm around her, and for the first time since leaving Bitterroot Springs, she felt truly safe. Not because there was no danger, but because she was not facing it alone. Shapa's fingers traced gentle patterns on her arm as they lay watching stars appear one by one in the darkening sky. The following days brought them closer to their destination, both in miles and in understanding. The careful reserve that had existed between them dissolved, replaced by an easy affection that manifested in small ways. Shapa's hand on her back as they crossed difficult terrain, Rose's fingers brushing his as she handed him food. Glances that lingered and smiles that came more readily. They were becoming something more than companions. Something that neither rushed to define but both recognized on a morning bright with early summer sun. They crested a ridge and saw below them a vast expanse of rolling grassland stretching to the horizon. The Canadian territories, Shapa said, pointing to the distant north. Perhaps another week of travel. Rose looked at the endless space and felt something shift inside her. A week, she repeated. And then what? Shapa turned to her, his expression serious. Then we find a place to stop. A place to build instead of run. He reached for her hand. If that is what you want. Rose squeezed his fingers, feeling the calluses earned through survival and the warmth that spoke of life. It is what I want, she said. With you, they began the descent toward new territory, toward an uncertain future that somehow felt less frightening than the past they had left behind. Behind them lay Bitterroot Springs and auction platforms, and all the cruelty that had driven them into the wilderness. Ahead lay possibility, as vast and open as the grassland spreading before them. And between past and future, in this present moment, they had each other. That evening, they made camp in a grove of aspens whose leaves whispered secrets in the breeze. As darkness fell, Shapa built up the fire while Rose prepared their meal. The domestic simplicity of it struck her suddenly. How natural it felt to work alongside him. How their movements complemented each other without need for direction. This, she thought. This quiet cooperation, this shared purpose. This was what she had been seeking without knowing it, after they ate. Shapa pulled out a small piece of wood and his knife and began carving. Rose watched his hands work, noting the concentration on his face. "What are you making?" she asked. He looked up with a slight smile. "Something I should have made long ago." He continued working, and gradually the wood took shape. A bird, wings spread in flight. When he finished, he handed it to her. "For you," he said. "To remember that you chose to fly rather than stay caged." Rose held the carving carefully, feeling the smooth warmth under her fingers. It was beautiful in its simplicity, every line purposeful and clean. "I will treasure this," she said, her voice thick with emotion. Shapa's smile widened. "It is just wood." "No," Rose said firmly. "It is more than that. It is a promise that the future can be different than the past. It is hope carved into form." Shapa reached out and pulled her close, and Rose went willingly into his embrace. They sat wrapped together, watching the fire and listening to the night sounds of a land that was becoming less foreign with each passing day. Tomorrow they would continue north, would push closer to their destination and whatever new life waited there. But tonight, they had this moment, this fire, this closeness that felt like coming home to a place neither had known existed. As stars wheeled overhead and the fire burned down to glowing embers, Rose felt Shapa's breathing even out in sleep. She stayed awake a while longer, holding the wooden bird and thinking about journeys and destinations. About how sometimes the greatest distance traveled was not measured in miles but in the space between who you were and who you chose to become. She had been a frightened woman in a saloon, serving drinks and swallowing dignity. She had become someone who could survive mountains and storms and the vast loneliness of wilderness. But more than that, she had become someone who knew how to hope again. Sleep finally claimed her there in Shapa's arms. And her dreams were filled not with the past shadows, but with visions of a future bright with possibility. A cabin not unlike Harrison's, but built by their own hands. Gardens growing food they had planted. Days filled with purpose and nights filled with peace. And through it all, the presence of the man beside her, steady and strong, and choosing her just as she had chosen him. It was a good dream, and when morning came with its demands and challenges, the dream would still be there, waiting to become real. The final week of their journey brought them through country that seemed to breathe with life renewed. The grasslands rolled endlessly beneath vast skies where clouds drifted like ships on an invisible sea. Wildflowers carpeted the meadows in riots of color, yellow and purple and white, nodding in the constant breeze. Rose had never seen so much open space, and it filled her with an exhilaration that made her want to run and shout and laugh with pure joy. They traveled during the cooler hours of morning and evening, resting through the heat of midday in whatever shade they could find. The rhythm was leisurely now, no longer driven by fear or desperation, but by the simple pleasure of movement toward a chosen destination. Shapa taught Rose to identify edible plants that grew in the grasslands, showed her how to read the subtle signs that indicated water ahead, and shared stories of his grandfather who had traveled these same lands generations before. One afternoon, they encountered a small herd of wild horses grazing in a valley. The animals lifted their heads as the humans approached, nostrils flaring, muscles tensed for flight. Shapa stopped and gestured for Rose to do the same. "Watch," he said quietly. "The lead mare will decide if we are threat or curiosity." They stood motionless while the mare studied them with intelligent dark eyes. Finally, she snorted and returned to grazing, and the rest of the herd followed her lead. "They are magnificent," Rose breathed. Shapa nodded, his eyes distant. "My people believed horses were gifts from the spirits, that they chose to carry us not because we mastered them, but because we earned their trust." He looked at Rose. Like all good partnerships, it must be chosen by both sides. Rose understood he was speaking about more than horses, and warmth spread through her chest at the implication. As they continued north, they began to see more signs of human presence. A trail worn by frequent use, the remains of old campfires, distant smoke that spoke of settlements beyond the horizon. One morning, they crested a rise and saw below them a small community, perhaps a dozen structures clustered near a river, fields spreading out in neat rectangles. People moved among the buildings, tiny figures going about the business of living. Shapa studied the settlement with careful attention. "It looks peaceful," he said. "Established but not crowded. Far enough from the territories we left that our story may not have reached here." He glanced at Rose. "Do you want to go down? See if this might be a place to stop." Rose felt nervousness flutter in her stomach, the familiar anxiety that came with encountering strangers. But beneath it was something stronger, the knowledge that she could not hide forever, that building a life meant engaging with the world, even when it was frightening. "Let us go carefully," she said. "See how we are received before we commit to anything." Shapa agreed, and they began the descent toward the settlement. As they approached, a man working in a field straightened and watched them come. He said something over his shoulder, and two others emerged from a nearby structure. Rose felt tension coil through her body, memories of hostile stares and cruel words rising unbidden. But the man who approached them first wore an expression of curiosity rather than hostility. His face was weathered by sun and work, his clothes simple but well-maintained. "Good day to you," he called out in accented English. "You look like you have traveled far." Shapa nodded cautiously. "We have come from the south, seeking a place to settle." The man's eyebrows rose. "You picked good timing. We are always needing more hands, especially with planting season here." The man introduced himself as Henrik, a Norwegian who had established this community 5 years prior with other immigrants seeking fresh starts. As he led them toward the center of the settlement, more people emerged, their faces showing the same open curiosity that Henrik displayed. Rose noticed the diversity among them, faces from different lands and backgrounds, all drawn together by the same desire for new beginnings in unclaimed country. Henrik brought them to a woman named Elsa, who appeared to run the communal kitchen. She looked Rose and Shapa up and down with sharp eyes, then nodded as if satisfied by what she saw. "You are hungry," she stated rather than asked. "Come, eat first. Talk second." The food she provided was simple but plentiful: bread and cheese and cold meat, washed down with fresh milk. Rose ate slowly, savoring flavors she had not tasted in weeks. While they ate, Henrik explained how the community functioned. "We share the work and share the harvest," he said. "Everyone contributes what they can, receives what they need. We have farmers, builders, a blacksmith, even a teacher for the children." His expression grew serious. "We do not care where people come from or what they left behind. We care only that they work hard and treat others with respect." "What about?" Rose hesitated, searching for words. "What about people who might not be welcomed everywhere?" Henrik's gaze was steady. "You mean because he is native and you are white?" Rose nodded, preparing for rejection. Henrik shrugged. "We have 3 mixed families here already. Also people who fled religious persecution. A man who was imprisoned unjustly in his homeland. A woman who ran from an abusive husband. We all have stories. We do not judge." The relief that flooded through Rose was so intense it made her dizzy. Beside her, she felt Shapa relax in a way she had not seen since they left Dakota's camp. "Is there land available?" he asked. Henrik smiled. "More land than we can use. Pick a spot that suits you, build on it, work it. After a year, if you stay and contribute, it becomes yours by community agreement." Simple as that. They spent the rest of the day being shown around the settlement. The people they met were uniformly welcoming, some offering advice on good building sites, others promising to help with construction when the time came. Children ran past laughing, paying no attention to the newcomers beyond brief curious glances. It felt surreal to Rose after so long in the wilderness. This return to community without the weight of judgment she had carried in Bitterroot Springs. By evening, they had selected a piece of land on a slight rise overlooking the river. The soil was good, Henrik confirmed, and the position would provide both view and drainage. "This is yours if you want it," he said. Shapa looked at Rose, a silent question in his eyes. She nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. "We want it," Shapa told Henrik. "This is where we stopped running." That night, they camped on their new land under a sky so full of stars, it seemed impossible they could all fit in the heavens. They sat close together, not speaking, simply absorbing the reality that their journey had reached its destination. Finally, Rose broke the silence. "I cannot quite believe it," she said. "That we are here. That we are safe. That we found a place that will accept us." Shapa's arm tightened around her shoulders. "I could not have made this journey without you," he said quietly. "Not just the physical journey, but the one that mattered more. Learning to trust again. Learning to hope. You gave me that." Rose turned to face him, seeing in the starlight the man who had been a stranger on an auction platform, then a companion in survival, and now something she could finally name. "I love you," she said, the words simple and true. Shapa's breath caught, and for a moment he simply looked at her, his dark eyes reflecting starlight. Then he cupped her face in his hands with infinite gentleness. "I love you," he replied, his voice rough with emotion. "From the moment you shouted across that square, demanding to buy my freedom. Perhaps even before, from a cold night 3 years ago when you could have closed the door, but chose kindness instead." They came together in a kiss that tasted of journeys completed and futures beginning, of hardships survived and joys anticipated. When they finally pulled apart, both were breathing hard, foreheads pressed together in the gesture that had become their own. "We will build a good life here," Shapa said. "Together." Rose smiled against his lips. "Together," she agreed, The next morning brought Henrik and 5 other men to their land, carrying tools and materials. "We build the frame today," Henrik announced cheerfully. "Tomorrow you can start on walls. In a week, you will have shelter good enough to last winter." Rose tried to protest the generosity, but Henrik waved her off. "Everyone here received the same help when they started. Now you help the next newcomers." This is how community works. The days that followed were filled with purposeful activity. Rose worked alongside the women, learning to chink logs with moss and clay, while Shapa labored with the men on the heavier construction. In the evenings, exhausted but satisfied, they would sit on their partially completed porch and watch the sun set over their land. Sometimes they talked, making plans for gardens and livestock and all the ordinary dreams of settled life. Sometimes they simply held hands in companionable silence. 2 weeks after their arrival, the cabin was complete. It was simple, one large room with a loft for sleeping and a stone fireplace that Shapa had built with meticulous care. The door fit snugly, the roof was watertight, and the windows had real glass that Henrik had brought from his own surplus. On the day they moved in their few belongings, Elsa appeared with a pot of stew and a loaf of fresh bread. "For your first meal in your home," she said with a warm smile. That evening, Rose stood in the doorway of their cabin and looked out at the settlement below, smoke rising from chimneys, lights beginning to glow in windows as families gathered for supper. She felt Shapa come up behind her, his arms wrapping around her waist, his chin resting on her shoulder. "What are you thinking?" he asked. Rose leaned back against him, feeling his solid warmth and strength. "I am thinking about how far we have come," she said. "Not just in distance, but in everything else. Do you have regrets?" Shapa asked quietly. Rose turned in his arms to face him. "Not a single one," she said firmly. "Every hard step, every cold night, every moment of fear, it all led here. To this place. To you. To a future I can choose instead of one forced upon me." She touched his face. "Do you have regrets?" Shapa smiled, a full genuine smile that transformed his usually serious features. "I regret only that I did not find you sooner," he said. "But perhaps the timing was right. Perhaps we both needed to be broken before we could be rebuilt into something stronger." Rose kissed him softly. "Perhaps," she agreed. "Or perhaps we simply needed each other." As autumn approached, their homestead took fuller shape. Rose planted a garden with seeds donated by neighbors, and to her delight, things actually grew under her care. Shapa hunted and traded his skills with other settlers, building a reputation as someone reliable and skilled. They acquired 2 chickens from Henrik, then a goat from another family. Life developed a comfortable routine of domestic partnership. One crisp October morning, Rose woke to find Shapa already up and working on something at the table. "What are you making?" she asked, wrapping a blanket around her shoulders against the chill. Shapa looked up with an expression that mixed nervousness and hope. "Something I have been thinking about for a while," he said. He held up what he had been crafting, 2 simple rings carved from antler, one slightly smaller than the other. Rose's breath caught. Shapa stood and took her hand. "Rose Daniels," he said formally, "you bought my freedom on an auction platform. You saved my life when I was dying of infection. You walked through mountains and storms at my side. You chose to build a life with me when you could have chosen safety elsewhere." He held up the smaller ring. "Will you choose me again, permanently, as husband?" Tears streamed down Rose's face as she nodded vigorously. "Yes," she managed to say. "Yes, absolutely yes." Shapa slipped the ring onto her finger, then handed her the larger one. She placed it on his finger with trembling hands, and they stood there in their simple cabin, bound by promises witnessed only by the morning light streaming through the windows. It was perfect. They married formally a week later in a ceremony held in the settlement's common building. Henrik stood as witness, along with Elsa and a dozen other community members who had become friends. There was no preacher, so they spoke their vows directly to each other, promising partnership and loyalty and love through whatever hardships might come. Afterward, there was music and dancing and more food than Rose had seen in one place since leaving civilization. As winter settled over the land, Rose and Shapa spent long evenings by their fire, content in the home they had built and the life they were creating. Sometimes Rose would take out the wooden bird Shapa had carved for her during their journey, running her fingers over its smooth surface and marveling at how far she had flown from that cage in Bitterroot Springs. Sometimes Shapa would hold the stone his mother had given him, the one he had passed to Rose during their darkest moment, and feel gratitude for the protection it had provided. One snowy evening, as they lay together in their loft bed under piles of warm furs, Shapa asked Rose if she ever thought about going back. Back where, Rose asked. To visit Dakota, perhaps, Shapa said. Or even to Bitterroot Springs, to show people what became of us. Rose considered this. Someday perhaps we visit Dakota, she said. He and Mina were kind to us, and I would like them to see how their help bore fruit. But Bitterroot Springs. She shook her head. That place has nothing for me. My life is here now. Shapa pulled her closer. Our life is here, he corrected gently. Rose smiled in the darkness. Our life, she agreed. And it was true. They had ceased being two separate people on individual journeys and had become something unified, a partnership that made both stronger. The woman who had been sold at auction and the man who had bought his freedom had found something neither had dared hope for. A place to belong and someone to belong with. Spring came eventually, as it always does, bringing green to the brown land and warmth to the cold air. Rose discovered she was pregnant in April, and the joy on Shapa's face when she told him was something she would carry in her memory forever. They prepared for this new chapter with the same determination they had brought to everything else, building a cradle that Shapa carved with intricate patterns, gathering supplies under Elsa's experienced guidance. Their daughter was born in early winter, arriving with a lusty cry that announced her displeasure with the cold world. She had Rose's auburn hair and Shapa's dark eyes, and she was perfect in every way. They named her Aida, after Shapa's sister, and Hope for the gift she represented. Aida Hope, Rose whispered, holding the tiny bundle and feeling love so fierce it was almost frightening. The community rallied around them as new parents, bringing food and advice and offers to help with anything needed. Henrik carved a rattle for the baby. Elsa taught Rose songs to soothe a fussy infant. Other mothers shared wisdom earned through their own experiences. It was everything Rose's own mother might have done. And the kindness of these people who had been strangers less than a year ago brought tears to her eyes. On a spring evening when Aida was 6 months old and beginning to show her personality, strong-willed and curious, Rose sat on their porch watching Shapa play with their daughter. He held her up to see a bird in a nearby tree, speaking to her in his language, teaching her words she was too young to understand but would grow into. Rose felt a contentment so complete it seemed impossible that she had once been that desperate woman serving drinks in a saloon, that Shapa had once stood bound on an auction platform. That feels like someone else's life, she said aloud. Shapa looked over, Aida gurgling happily in his arms. What does? All of it, Rose said. The auction, the running, the fear. It seems like it happened to different people. Shapa came to sit beside her, adjusting Aida so she could see both her parents. Perhaps it did, he said thoughtfully. Perhaps those people died in the mountains and we were born in their place. Rose leaned against him, watching their daughter reach for a butterfly that fluttered past. I like that idea, she said. That we got to choose who we became instead of accepting who the world told us we had to be. Shapa kissed the top of her head. We are still choosing, he reminded her. Every day. And I choose this, all of it, with you. As the sun set and painted the sky in shades of orange and pink, Rose looked at the life spread before her. The cabin they had built with their own hands and the help of kind neighbors. The garden that would soon be planted with seeds saved from last year's harvest. The settlement below where smoke rose from chimneys and children played in the evening light. And beside her, the man who had become her partner, her love, her home, holding the daughter they had created together. Years would pass, and their family would grow. More children would arrive, each loved as fiercely as the first. The homestead would expand, becoming more prosperous with each season. They would face challenges, because life always brought challenges, but they would face them together, drawing strength from the bond they had forged through hardship and choice. Sometimes travelers would pass through and ask about their story, and Rose and Shapa would share it, hoping it might give courage to others who felt trapped by circumstance. But on this particular evening, with the sun setting and their daughter laughing at the play of light on her father's face, Rose felt only the present moment. The past was behind them, lessons learned but not burdens carried. The future was ahead, full of possibility and promise. And the present was perfect, this collection of small, ordinary miracles that together made a life worth living. "Wait, name your price," Rose had shouted across an auction square in what felt like another lifetime. She had been offering money then, $75 that represented her entire savings and her desperate hope for something different. But what she had really been offering, what she had been asking for in return, was the chance to write a new story. To step off the path the world had laid out for her and forge one of her own choosing. And here, in this cabin on this land with this man and this child, Rose had found the answer to that long-ago offer. The price had been high, measured in exhaustion and fear and moments when giving up seemed easier than continuing. But what she had gained was beyond price. A life of purpose and partnership, of love freely given and received, of belonging to a place and being claimed by people who valued her for who she was rather than what she could provide. Shapa stood, lifting Aida high to make her squeal with delight. Then brought her to Rose. "Time for sleep, little one," he said softly. "Tomorrow brings new adventures." Rose took their daughter and held her close, breathing in the sweet scent of her, feeling the trust in the way the baby relaxed against her chest. Shapa's arm came around both of them, and they stood that way as stars began to appear in the darkening sky. "This is everything," Rose whispered. "This is everything I never knew to dream of." Shapa kissed her temple. "Then let us keep dreaming together," he said, "and see what else we can build." Rose smiled, her heart full to overflowing. "Yes," she agreed. "Let us keep dreaming. Together."
Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.